Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. As always, Paddy, how are you this week?
Positively fantastic, Gary. I think at the time of this recording, although this is before Christmas, this will come out the Monday after Christmas. So I hope everyone has had a phenomenal Christmas.
If it happened.
If it
If
happened,
it
if
happened.
we were allowed. I hear the Brits are perhaps not allowed to have Christmas, but look, that's a
They
whole,
cancelled Jesus,
literally,
of all things,
of
bro.
all things, like in a predominantly Christian nation. You just hate to see it, Gary. But
Yeah.
anyway, look, that's not here, and potentially this might even come out before Christmas. So who knows? But what are we discussing today? What is the topic of discussion? Well, actually, before we get into that, Gary, how are you? I always forget to ask you how you are. I just want to make sure all our listeners know if you're okay or not.
This could be the time where I just absolutely empty it out onto the table. I'm like, I'm having such a hard time these last 6 months. You never ask me, bro. I'm good. Mostly good. The last few weeks now, to be honest, have been pretty rough in terms of study and exams and trying to balance the whole living life and doing a bit of training with the restrictions on the gyms and all that sort of stuff. So I think, like many people this year, which this will probably be like our last podcast that even comes out this year, even. Thank
Yeah,
God.
it should be out on the 28th of
Yeah, so this will
December.
be the last one of the year. I think it's obviously been a chaotic year. Most people will probably have felt that. And I think that now that we're potentially facing into a third lockdown, maybe, we don't know. Everyone's like, oh my God, please, no, not again. Don't do this to me. Because everyone's thinking 2021 is going to roll around and then we're all going to be happy. So for me, like nobody or like everyone else, the shutdown of the gyms, the kind of back and forth with the gyms, the jiu-jitsu still not being back, like that's one of the things that really is very late to come back because of the contact, and then other things like the whole college studying online, us having uncertainty with our business, are the gyms going to stay open, what do we say to our clients? So there's been lots of uncertainty, and I think we'll all be glad to see the back of 2020, presuming 2021 might be a little bit better.
Hopefully we won't have to start singing Sic Semper Tyrannis in the streets and revolt against our unbenevolent overlords. But anyway, look, that's beside the point. Gary, the actual topic of discussion today, what is it going to be?
So today what we're going to talk about, again, we're continuing with this thread of discussing obesity and, the line of causality, you could say, and the different things that we can do to potentially intervene as individuals and as people who are maybe extending our vote for certain policies, understanding the views of public health professionals, understanding why maybe people might recommend different things at different stages of the lifespan to reduce obesity risk, etc. Okay, because this is one of those things where you do really have to understand the full thread of causality, which is why I put it like that, because very often when we reduce it down to some of the topics, even just discussing the different things that influence obesity, we very rarely extend it out, temporarily and ask ourselves, what initially happened, and then what, and then what, and then what. And I think of it like, if someone was telling you a story and they were recounting the order of events, that'd be a really important part of the story, because if they're not telling you the order of events, then that's not particularly helpful. And that's especially important when we look at childhood development generally, but particularly when we start to look at obesity risk and future risk of cardiometabolic disease, because obviously, as we'll touch on in this podcast, there's many different points where, feeding behavior isn't necessarily dictated solely by the individual. The obvious example being breastfeeding or early childhood nutrition. But even as we move into adolescence and beyond, we'll still expose in this podcast, I hope, how so many things are influenced beyond just the individual, but also while recognizing that there's power there too in them being able to lead change.
Yeah, and see, this is something that we've obviously been struggling with effectively over the last few podcasts to discuss, because there's multiple ways that you can, first of all, look at this obesity epidemic. It's multifactorial, like we've discussed, right? But also, it's like there's multiple ways you can, I'm going to say, address the situation. Like, obviously, there's some things that you can do to take, individual responsibility for, that individual accountability aspect of things, but also how that extends into the individual accountability of what you do to your children, or how you treat your children, how you raise your children, all that kind of stuff. But then also how your vote in a democratic society, assuming like most people that listen to this or watch this are in a democratic society, like your vote has some weight in terms of government policy and what's going on with all that kind of stuff. So you need to be as informed as you can be around these topics. And as Gary was saying there, like, we need to have that thread of events, that kind of timeline of the situation that's going on. And well, the last few episodes we've been discussing, some, we'll say, mechanistic stuff, some hypothetical stuff, some, just pure causal stuff. One of the things I do want to touch on, and the reason I want to touch on it is not so much to be like preaching in terms of, telling you how to raise your kids, or telling you, whatever, like basically how to live your life and how to live your kids' life, or get them set up for a good life. Like, realistically, I don't really care, like I can only live my life, I can only do my stuff. However, I think that if we look after the children, we end up 10, 20, 30 years with a better society overall, so that's my kind of perspective on it. And I think a lot of times when we talk about childhood obesity, a lot of stuff gets very preachy, very, much, finger pointing, finger wagging, a blame game on the parents. And that's obviously not what we want to do here. And do realize that as we go through this discussion, because what I want to do with this discussion is lay out a kind of scenario rather than telling you what goes wrong in terms of childhood obesity and the causes of that. I want to discuss more so in terms of how we could potentially move things to remedy the situation. And while we will be doing further podcasts in terms of how to tackle the obesity epidemic, in terms of like, if you're a personal trainer, how to train a client with obesity, like stuff like that, I do want to put this podcast at this point while we're still kind of going through some of the more mechanistic, the more causal stuff, the more of the issues around obesity. I do want to put it here because this is kind of the start. This is where it all starts in terms of the individual level, right? What happens to you as a child in terms of like, you don't have a huge amount of say in what's going on when you are, as Gary said, like breastfeeding or whatever, or bottle feeding or like formula feeding. Like, you don't have a huge amount to say. You're a child, like it's out of your control, right? But that stuff does leave an imprint in terms of how you then go on to interact with the world. Like, we know in utero and even in early breastfeeding, or even I should say breastfeeding versus formula feeding, we know there are epigenetic changes that occur that can set you up for a higher propensity for obesity or a lower propensity for obesity. So this stuff is important, right? It's important to understand. And again, I don't want this to be a session of like finger wagging and blaming of like, you should do this or you should have done this and you're a bad parent because you didn't do this. Like, ultimately that doesn't help move the conversation along, right? And what we want to do ideally is walk through how we could effectively intervene in childhood to move society to a better position with the obesity epidemic that we're facing. Does that make sense, Gary?
Yes, sir.
Trying to add to that before we get stuck in?
No, we can get stuck in. Let's go.
Right. So effectively, we're going to start and we're just going to talk through some good habits that you can bring into your child's life, right? Because like, obviously the earlier the better with a lot of this stuff, but if you have a child that's 8, 10, 12, like, there is still time to significantly intervene. And this is especially true before puberty. And like, obviously during childhood, you have, early growth and all that stuff. And like, a lot of the stuff that you're going to be left with for your lifetime, like, it happens there. But also puberty is also a time where a lot of this stuff gets solidified, right? I always like to use, as anyone who listens to the podcast, I always like to use more visceral or more picturesque, I should say, imagery in terms of examples how this actually plays out. For example, with this, like, you could be obese as a teenager. Now, this is obviously somewhat hypothetical, somewhat speculative, and somewhat hyperbolic. But you could be obese as a teenager and as a result have reductions in testosterone in the body because some of that testosterone is being converted to estrogen. And as a result, you have less testosterone because estrogen is a negative feedback inhibitor of testosterone secretion. And that can lead to a situation where you have less dihydrotestosterone in the body. And DHT is one of the signals that actually dramatically influences penis size in males, right? So if you have less DHT in your teen years, you could be left with a smaller penis for the rest of your life, right? Now, that is hypothetical. I'm not saying that an individual that was at 17% body fat versus 15% body fat is going to have a smaller penis for the rest of their life. However, I just like to use that because you're all going to remember that, right? You might not remember the exact mechanism, but you're going to remember that the stuff that you do earlier in life is going to have an impact for the rest of your life. And that's what I want to get across. And while that's obviously a more graphic representation, I bring that up because, again, you're going to remember it, but a lot of other things are happening. And while I can say that, you're going to get these epigenetic changes, that's not as, fixable in your memory. You might remember, epigenetic changes, but to discuss all of them, we'd be here all day. There's papers on this stuff. There's entire fields of science on this stuff. And, we're not going to get into all of that. However, what we can get into is setting up a situation where you're going to be better able to, let's say, control obesity levels in childhood, or at least introduce better health habits so that even if the individual is obese or overweight in childhood, there's a way out from that. It's not a jail sentence, if you will, in terms of you're not obese as a child and then you're just, I have no habits. I have to break 20 years of conditioning, 20 years of nutrition habits, exercise habits to then try to deal with this obesity when I go out into the world as, an 18, 19, 20-year-old and have to take personal responsibility for my actions, So there's a lot of stuff that you can bring in earlier. And obviously, again, the earlier the better with a lot of this stuff, and hopefully move your child or, children overall into a better position with their overall health. And as I said, that's ultimately the only thing I really care about with the obesity epidemic. I'm kind of a bit black pilled on the issue. While I think at the individual level, I'm we can definitely impact change. I've trained I've trained obese individuals. I had one client that lost 100 kilos. That's what I weigh, so I've trained individuals that are significantly overweight. I've seen the struggles there. And while on an individual level, I can clearly see that, a large portion of change can be made to that individual's life, right? I'm kind of black pilled on the population level in terms of how we would move the whole society towards a better relationship with food, right? However, in my mind, I'm if we got the kids in a good place, our generation or the generations around us might not be in a great position, but at least we know, in future, hopefully, we would be in a better position. Does that make sense, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the hallmarks of a good society that I want to live in are respecting the elderly and respecting kids and everyone else in between. Let's go to war with each other.
Especially the young men, is it?
Oh, yes. Well, obviously,
Anyway, right. So there's a few things. And again, I don't want this to be preachy in terms of telling you how to raise your kid or what to do. I want to more so have this as a thought experiment in terms of if you were thinking about this stuff, what are the things that you would do for a child to hopefully move towards a less obesogenic environment for that child? And one of the things that you can really easily do, and I say that as someone who firstly doesn't have kids, that's my bias. However, everyone in my family has huge families. So I probably have more parental experience than quite a lot of people listening to this because I basically raised about 20 kids. So take from that what you will. I've changed far too many nappies for someone who doesn't actually have kids themselves. But anyway.
Did you breastfeed?
Yeah, I actually just started injecting myself with a load of prolactin and then stimulating my nipples. It really releases a lot of oxytocin as well in my brain. I felt really good while I was expressing milk for those children.
Nice.
Anyway, one of the things that you can do, which again, on paper, really stupid simple, right? In reality, in practice, it's a lot harder, especially if you're trying to intervene with this intervention later on in that child's life. And the intervention is bring in vegetables to the child's diet, right? Like that's something that if you can do in an earlier position in a child's life. First of all, we know with individuals with obesity, like you can actually have a situation where calories are sufficient or even to an excess, but they're actually malnourished in terms of getting actual nutrients. Like I always use the example that 10% of students are subclinically vitamin C deficient, or I should say another way, if you remember your history, like 10% of students are basically at risk for scurvy, what pirates used to get when they were at sea, right? Because they don't get enough vitamin C in their diets, right? So like we know this can happen, even though we live in a society where it's so simple to go down to the shop and just get a multivitamin and cover all your bases if you knew your diet was insufficient in some areas, right? But obviously a better way, thinking longer term with the child, with society, etc., like if we can set up a situation where we intervene early with getting them to like vegetables, that's a win, right? Because again, it leads to a situation where they're getting more fiber in their diet, getting more nutrition in their diet in terms of like micronutrients, phytonutrients, all that kind of stuff. But also a situation where they're going to be better able to manage their hunger cues, because we know consistently individuals who eat more vegetables are better able to handle their hunger, because it is very satiating food stuff to eat, especially if you are eating more fibrous vegetables, more low calorie, high volume vegetables, right? So that's something that you can do. Now, there's two issues with that, obviously. And the first is children generally don't like vegetables. And this is multifactorial. A large part of it is because children generally don't like anything that is out of the normal. And if you've only ever been feeding them, I don't know, rusks and liga, like these fucking bland, like wheat-based foods, it's like they're not going to like something that doesn't have the same texture, it doesn't have the same taste, whatever. Like kids don't like different things, right? And like they basically end up eating stuff that's all either just bland white stuff. They're like, oh, I want chips tonight, or I'll have bread, or they end up liking like obviously super sweet things. They're like, oh yeah, can I have this super chocolate packed, sugar laden, whatever cereal, whatever, like kids end up doing that, whereas they don't end up liking vegetables. And a lot of this is, again, just that's the way humans are wired. But a lot of this is as well because they weren't fed those things at an earlier age. Like if you go from a situation where you're weaned from either formula or breastfeeding, like we should say that breastfeeding is obviously ideal, but there's a lot of situations where that's not an actual accessible intervention. So like I don't want to make people feel bad because they weren't able to breastfeed, especially in like places like Ireland where in the 90s, like they were told that formula was better than breastfeeding. Like that was actual advertising, so it's like I wasn't breastfed, like I was formula fed, right?
Me too, I think.
So it's like that was the advertising in the 90s. So like you shouldn't feel bad if you're listening to this and you have kids that are in their 20s and 30s or whatever, and you're like, oh shit, man, did I give them something bad? It's like, it's not bad, but breast is best. That's generally the case, but obviously there's a lot of situations where that's not possible. But anyway, look, what I'm talking about is if you were to wean from either formula or breast milk, if you could wean onto vegetables, like pureed vegetables, not necessarily like the stuff that you buy in the store that's full of salt. Like it's actually recklessly high in sodium, a lot of those things, and sugar and stuff, because makes them more likely to eat all their tomato puree or whatever the fuck it is. But obviously if you can make it yourself effectively, that would be ideal, getting your child to like vegetables long term. However, like we are very much aware, if you've been listening to this series, that there's a lot of, we'll call them socioeconomic barriers to that, as we've discussed previously, like access to this stuff, access to fresh vegetables, access to stores that are catering for the stuff that you want, access to the knowledge, the information, etc. So we're 100% aware of the socioeconomic ramifications of what we're saying, and we're going to have to park that for a minute to actually discuss this stuff, because like we can't cover that every single time we give a recommendation. Like that's implied. We understand that now. We're going to talk about that in future. We've talked about it in the past on various podcasts. It is definitely a huge consideration in all of this. You're going to have to find some way to navigate that. And again, we'll touch on that in the future. So do you have anything to add to the introduce vegetables stuff, Gary? I think that's a fairly good thing that we could do as a society for childhood obesity at whatever the age is. Get children to enjoy vegetables.
Yeah, and like you say, you know, that early period, like it does seem to be quite important, including like when the weaning period is, even like, you know, as you say, breast is best, and also there seems to be like a temporal component to that, in that if you can keep up to about at least 6 or 7 months, kind of from what I've read anyway, seems to
Yeah,
be
6 months is what they say. Just as a historical perspective on this,
mhm.
like most humans, or first of all, women generally didn't reach menopause, purely because they were basically amenorrheic or oligomenorrheic because they were breastfeeding for 2 years in most cases, right? And that also was both a natural form of contraception, because generally if you're not going to ovulate while you're breastfeeding, which that's what generally happens if you are breastfeeding as much as the child needs, not in all cases now. I'm not saying that you can have as much sex as you want while you're breastfeeding and you won't get pregnant. That's not the case. But a lot of the time they would breastfeed, like historically breastfeed for like 2 years, because again, that would become a form of contraception, and also like it was an easy form of feeding the child whatever. So like that's the historical perspective, but most organizations would say that 6 months is the kind of breastfeeding timeline. Again, even with that, there is obviously caveats, and that's not always possible, especially if you are a working female and you want to return to work. It's not like you can go back to work and be like, here, sorry, I actually have to whip my kid out here and breastfeed, you know. But obviously there are ways around that nowadays with, like, you know, breast expression pumps and whatever else. Like you can store it for later, and whoever's minding the child can feed it to them. And this is funny because I think we discussed it previously. Maybe you and me discussed it, but maybe we discussed it on the podcast. Like there is a whole load of like chrononutrition stuff around like breast milk, which I think is actually really fascinating in terms of like if you express that milk in the morning, like it has higher levels of like cortisol and wakefulness hormones and whatever else. Whereas if you express that milk in the evening and give it to your child, it has more melatonin and, you know, whatever else. So it's like there is a chrononutrition aspect to that. So you probably, if you are going to express milk, like I probably would express nighttime milk and give it to them at nighttime versus morning milk and give it to them in the morning. But obviously that's a further layer of complexity that potentially is a barrier to all this stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to layer on that historical perspective in terms of like 6 months is generally what government organizations recommend, but they also say, I think after 3 months as well, it's like that's kind of like the 12-week period. They're like, you should try do it for that first 3 months at least, ideally up to that kind of 6-7 month period. That seems to be a good place to be at. And again, obviously I don't know your fucking socioeconomic status, your situation, so like if you need to go back to work, like you need to go back to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, we're just saying, like, as it is, the evidence would at least suggest that up to that 6 or 7 month mark does reduce risk of the development of childhood obesity. And the thing that's really important here, I guess, as we discuss the early childhood period, is that it's not just about the early childhood period. So, like, one of your biggest predictors for going on to develop adulthood obesity and maintaining that for life is the development of it in childhood and adolescence. And that might seem obvious, but, you know, if you're a parent or something, you know, you mightn't necessarily think of what the ramifications of that are going forward. And it's not necessarily to say that you can just push a button and change it, but there is a fairly significant risk, like up to 5 times in some studies, of someone, if they are obese in childhood, to going on to basically maintaining that obesity in adulthood. So it's an important time.
100%. But yeah, so we're in agreement. Vegetables, good as a childhood intervention against obesity. Like it's
You're not going to get
fairly,
them on that carnivore hype, no?
maybe. And that's usually, I introduced that at like 8 years old. That's generally when that's coming later on, Gary. Don't worry. But anyway, another thing is like don't use food as a reward, right? And this seems fairly straightforward if you've ever actually like coached individuals. Like if you're a coach and you're coaching individuals with their nutrition, obviously, like don't use food as a reward. Like it sets up bad patterns with nutrition. And if you've ever dealt with someone that has, we'll call them disordered eating habits, like a lot of it does come from similar things to this in terms of using food as a reward. And what I mean by this is like people will effectively teach their kids that if they ever do anything good, you reward yourself with food, right? And that is somewhat intrinsic to humans in terms of like we have feast days and we have like bountiful harvest days. Like that's, we've been doing that for millennia. Like I'm not saying that we need to get rid of that practice. What I'm saying is people end up, rather than going like, oh, we had a feast day of, you know, meat and veg and our bountiful harvest, you know, it's like, no, your kid was like, oh yeah, I did really well in school today. And they're like, oh, here's a chocolate bar, you know? And that's happening multiple times per week, per month, per year, rather than like historically where it's like, oh yeah, we get like a feast day twice a year, you know? It's like you can still use food as a reward. It should just be very much, you know, a larger time frame between these rewards if you are going to use it as that, you know, like not everything needs to be rewarded with food, right? And a lot of parents do that. And again, I'm not pointing the blame. Like I understand why that is the case. Like you want to reward good behaviors. So like food is an easy one to reward, like here's some sweets, but it does set up negative patterns in future in terms of their ability to deal with their emotions, because every single time they, like an individual who has, you know, grown up like this, in this environment, they have to reward anything they do with food. And it's very easy to get into a situation where like you basically start rewarding the fact that you got through the day with food. And this can be further compounded where people effectively give their kids mixed messages, right? And like this is kind of like this kind of, we'll say like Pavlovian response thing, you know, with dogs or whatever, but or just operant conditioning, like reward conditioning, where people will use something as a reward for good behavior to try to encourage that good behavior, right? But when people are raising children, what often happens is people will use a reward, say sweets, chocolate, whatever, McDonald's, whatever it is, and they'll be like, this is your reward, right? For good behavior, for doing your chores, for doing well on an exam, whatever it is, right? But then they'll also use very similar things to placate their children, in terms of like your child is having a tantrum and you're like, oh, I just need this kid to shut up, so here's a sweet, you know? It's like that's extremely mixed messages for that child, where like obviously you have to navigate the situation, and obviously there's cases where you might have to do this, like they're screaming in a fucking, I don't know, the cinema or something, and you're just like, right, look, we need to watch this film, it's for your brother's birthday, you know, you need to be quiet, it's for him, you know, there's situations, right? But if we set up a situation where this child gets rewarded for good things with food and gets rewarded for bad things with food, like effectively all they know how to do to deal with their emotions is turn to food, right? Because that's what they've been taught their whole life. It's like whenever I feel higher emotions, either elation or, you know, negative, depressive emotions, whatever, it's like I turn to food. And you can obviously see how that sets up a situation where people turn to food pretty much every day for, you know, reward effectively. It's like, oh, I had a bad day in work. Cool. Where's the Ben and Jerry's, you know? Oh, I had a great day in work. Cool. We're going to have loads of sushi tonight, whatever it is, you know? It's like you set up a situation where you're always rewarding yourself, or, you know, effectively medicating yourself with food to treat your sadness or your depressive symptoms. I'm not saying you have depression, but like, you know, general life depressive symptoms. And that's just not a good place to be in. Now, how do you solve that? How do you navigate that? Like, it's going to be a case by case basis. This is not going to be a thing where I give you all the answers and go, this is exactly how you raise your kids. I'm just saying that you need to think a little bit deeper about this in terms of how you are actually rewarding or incentivizing behaviors with food, right? Like, I'm not saying that you can't do it. It certainly can be done well, and it certainly isn't a inherently negative thing, but it is something that you have to think a little bit deeper about when you are looking at actually raising a child and bringing in these things, or bringing in these things to reward or incentivize different behaviors. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, and I think another thing that goes beyond that as well is not even simply like how you're rewarding them or just shutting them up effectively, you know, as soon as the child gets loud in a particular area or whatever, or starts being bold, you just give them food. Along with that, there's also how you kind of lead yourself as well. And I think that's something that definitely plays into this, because if as a role model. For example, a parent basically lives in that way, in that, you know, they demonstrate that, oh, you treat yourself with food, but also if you're feeling bad, you know, you have food, and it's constantly some sort for high or low emotions. Then that's also learning in it mightn't be conditioning in such a way, but it's still learning through observation and through promoting a certain norm within the family. um, and then also there's just the aspect of, you know, how what the restrictions around food are in general within the home, which is, I guess, a slightly separate topic, but is very much related. Because I remember when growing up, or even if you just visited someone's house or whatever, it was always like a question, you know, can I get something from the cupboard, or can I have a biscuit, is what I used to always say, when I really meant, like, give me chocolate if you can give me chocolate, but, you know, can I have a biscuit? If you get a rich tea, you get a rich tea, that's fine. But that was like the question, because there had to be some sort of boundary. Like, you can't just go and take a packet of crisps, you can't just go and take chocolate. And having that kind of culture of free indulgence within the home is obviously a negative thing for children. But also, if that's reflected in the family, like, for example, if food is constantly, if I have a child and I'm constantly, you know, indulging in my favorite foods every day, and I don't have any restrictions or, you know, discipline on what I eat myself, then very clearly that sets up a poor culture in which that child is raised, then, that they might carry forward with them. So I think overall, just realizing that learning and education is not just about what you tell someone. Like, it's not just about the child knowing what to eat objectively based on macronutrients or whatever. It's also the observation. So, you know, how do the parents behave themselves? What do they actually say about food? You know, when they're using food, is it that they're using it for reward? Is that they're using it for punishment? Whatever. And then how do they speak to the child themselves as well? Is obviously important around this topic.
Yeah, there's a few things in that, and we're going to come back to the teach through example thing in a second.
Yeah.
But I do want to say that, like, it is really important that you basically don't have this kind of like excessive freedom with food environment. You know, like, maybe you could push that in terms of, like, you have fruit and veg out on the table, and it's like, yeah, you can eat that if you want to eat something. You
Yeah.
know, you're doing that. But also, we want to set up a situation where they have clear boundaries with food in terms of, like, what's accessible to them throughout the day, but also in terms of they have structure to their day. It's like, here's your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know, like, you don't want to set up a situation where your child is effectively snacking all day long, because that sets up a situation where you effectively just get calorie escalation throughout their life, you know, where it's like, oh yeah, I used to snack on like a rich tea, as you say, Gary, you know, but then it's like, oh yeah, I'm outside the house and I'm like, oh, I wouldn't mind a snack or something. They go into the shop, it's a chocolate bar because they have money, you know. It's like, I'll just get whatever the fuck I want, you know. And then they're doing that 2 or 3 times per day. They have it in their house, you know. Like, you go to your friend's cupboard and you look in, it's just all crisps, chocolates, you know, whatever. It's like there's just freely accessible, hyper caloric, hyper tasty foods available to them, you know. And like, as much as, like, I do believe in free will and stuff, there is obviously some sort of a limit to that, in terms of, like, if it's there, you're going to eat it, you know. Like, and obviously people are coming listening to this after Christmas, and you can see the effect that having lots of sweets, chocolates, whatever else in the house has on your ability to be perfectly disciplined and adherent to your diet. Like, it takes far more willpower, and while willpower is not finite as was once believed, it is still harder to stay on track when you are constantly being bombarded with easily accessible, hypercaloric, hyper palatable, fucking damn tasty food. You know, like, I know if I go downstairs now, there's loads of chocolate that I could just reach into and get. You know, like, there's no problem with that, and it's more of a surprise to me that more people aren't obese, rather than the
Yeah.
fact that we have the obesity epidemic that we do have. You know, like, I would, based on just the environment and how we could set up the environment for ourselves if we wanted to, I'm surprised 90% of the people aren't obese, you know. So, like, it's completely understandable. However, if we are talking about this raising children topic in terms of, you know, the obesity epidemic and how we can intervene here to potentially move society into a better direction, like, just stop having free accessible food around the house. Like, if your child's like, I want food, I'm hungry, I want crisps or whatever, you're like, okay, cool, well, we only have apples, you know. It's like, that's if they are actually hungry, they'll eat the apples, right? Like they're not like, I know especially in Ireland, like they're very afraid of like your child expressed any kind of hunger whatsoever. It's like, make sure they are stuffed. It's like you have to eat. And I know other cultures are like that as well. Like especially when you discuss stuff like grandmothers, over your granny's house or whatever, it's like, oh, they feed you. Like that's basically Irish culture. But like babushka, has to feed you.
The Russian babushkas.
So like it's understandable. However, like your child is not going to starve by going hungry. Like they're not going, like if your child is already overweight or obese, like going hungry for an hour or two is not going to put them into such a negative energy balance that they're ruined for the rest of their life. It's like, no, it's going to teach them to better manage their hunger and also realign their expectations of what is available to them. If you're like, no, we don't do sweets in the house anymore, we do that as potentially something we do at parties or something, like, even though I'm saying like don't use it necessarily as a reward, but it's like, no, that's only for certain events we have these things. And that's something that you're going to have to navigate and help your children learn. And obviously the earlier you intervene with this stuff, the easier. Because I hate when people also say it's like, oh well, my child would never go for that. It's like, yeah, because your child is 9. It's like you've been doing everything opposite to this for 9 years. It's like they're obviously not going to, with one day of intervention, go, oh yeah, I'll actually just change all of these 9 years of my life and the way you've been raising me. I'm just going to change everything right overnight. But I would hope that as an adult, your willpower is bigger, stronger, better than a 9-year-old child's. So you should be able to move the conversation at least to a healthier place, right? But anyway, look, that we're getting kind of off track with that stuff. Basically, the food environment that is an obesogenic food environment for adults is still an obesogenic food environment for children. So don't have sweets, chocolates, etc., just lying around the house, especially if there's no boundaries around being able to reach into the cupboard or whatever and getting food. Like that's just a recipe for a kid to be able to go like, yeah, actually I'm ever so slightly mildly hungry. Or as we'll touch on later on, they saw an ad for some sort of fucking chocolate or something. They're like, oh yeah, actually I have chocolates in the cupboard, and then they reach for them, especially if it's available, right? But yeah, the next thing then, and again, it's very much in line with Irish culture. We touched on it before. This is like, don't teach your kids to finish their plate, right? Like you don't need to finish all the food on your plate. Like that's, well, yeah, like that would be great if we all gave the exact amount of food on a plate that individual needs, but we should realistically be teaching them to have better portion control, right? And one of the ways you can do this is through like the plate itself, like have children-sized plates. Like there's no reason for your child who is 8 to be getting the same size plate as you, an adult. Like I'm a whatever 95 kilo male. There's no reason for my 10 kilo fucking child to be getting the same size plate as me. Like it doesn't make sense. So you can obviously get smaller plates, but even if you don't get smaller plates, you can put out an adequate amount of food on that plate, which obviously involves you as an adult and parent learning about what an adequate amount of food is. And this is where I always refer back to that same like hand portion size control, which we've talked about on our website, we've talked about on the podcast before, but you can use your hand as guidelines for food. And your child also has hands, probably anyway, like it still holds true for them. And even if it's not perfectly accurate, because children do have slightly more demands for calories than would be appropriate for their body size, because generally they fucking run around like lunatics, and obviously they're growing, so there's a lot more energy input required. You are in a situation where, yeah, I'd rather just see them have to come back for seconds if they wanted more, rather than them always being taught that, oh, you're really full, you have to finish your plate, or you're not allowed go play after dinner or play football or whatever it is. It's like your plate must be finished, right? And even in the case you want to ensure that they finish their plate, like they always don't eat their vegetables, like you can save that for later and be like, yeah, you have to eat your vegetables for your fucking supper or your before bed meal if you want, like that's something that you can do, but basically get better portion size control. Don't teach them that they have to finish their plate, and on top of that, teach them to be more present while eating. And what I mean by this is like they're more present with the hunger cues that they have, like if they're actually hungry, if they're actually feeling full, like what does that feel like? How do they get on with that? Do they like the foods that they're eating? Do they not like the foods that they're eating? Like how can you modify that to make them more enjoyable? What would your child like to see? Like maybe they really enjoy chicken and you are always cooking beef or something. It's like how can you modify the family diet so that your child is in a good position with food? Like you're actually listening to them, and obviously to be able to accurately listen to them, they need to be able to accurately listen to themselves. So you're going to need to teach them that stuff, especially around hunger and fullness. Like that's one of the key skills. If you can teach your child to be able to listen to internal hunger cues and fullness cues, and then also teach them what a good diet is, like they're pretty much set up for life. Because like that's stuff that we teach to our clients now. I'll have like literally a 40-year-old client and I'm teaching them these things, and it's like if you had been able to learn this stuff as a child, like we would have been in so much better position throughout your entire life. So do you anything got to that, Gary?
No, I think that's good. Let's keep going.
Perfect. I was gonna touch on something else, but I'm gonna move on from that one. And this one is, we just touched on it a second ago. This is teach through example, right? And I mentioned there in terms of like the family diet, like that's something that you can teach by example. Like if you always go, okay, cool, I have to finish my plate. Like I have such a bad habit of, because if I didn't exercise, I genuinely would be obese. But if I have a plate in front of me, like I will literally lick the plate clean. Like I'm like, I finish every single thing. Like my girlfriend always gives out to me, like I will literally get the last grain of rice on that plate. Like there'll be nothing left. Gary will tell you as well, like meticulously clean eater. Like I never drop food because that's wasteful in my eyes. you know. But yeah, so like you need to teach your kids. Like that's not something that I necessarily want my kids, when I have them, to learn. So that's something that I'm going to have to be aware of when I am actually a parent, and sitting around the family table eating food. It's like perhaps I'm going to have to modify my behaviors so that they aren't learning that it's okay to lick your plate clean and finish every single last thing on it. Like that, they're the kind of things that you need to be aware of, because like Carrie said earlier on, children are basically little monkeys in terms of like monkey see, monkey do, and like they will do whatever you do, and like obviously we know this in terms of like smoking habits and childhood smoking habits if their parents smoked and stuff. But it also applies to the diet. Like if you always sit around the TV and watch TV while you're eating, like your children will just become accustomed to that and do that. And that's not necessarily a good thing to do, because as we said in the last point, it's not conducive to actually being aware and present with the food that you're eating. Like if you could easily mindlessly eat thousands of calories. All you have to do is distract yourself by watching TV. So anyone out there that's like, oh, I'm a really hard gainer, can't really eat foods, like just distract yourself. Pick a hyperpalatable food, distract yourself watching TV, and you will get thousands of calories down, believe me, right? But obviously that's not a recipe for a non-obesogenic environment, so don't eat your food around the TV. Basically set up the environment so that you have a non-obesogenic environment, and that's what we're kind of going on. But also realize that your kids are going to follow your example, and this applies both to the healthy food choices you make. Like if you always go, oh, I hate vegetables, like what are the chances your kids are going to like vegetables? Very low, right? If you just have these really weird reactions to food, being like, oh, it's disgusting, oh, it's horrible, like your kids are going to have the same reactions. If you don't eat protein, you don't eat meat or whatever, like your kids are likely going to have the same reactions. So they're going to pattern after you, right? And like effectively you are parentally modeling, like they're just modeling your behavior because they think that you are a successful individual in the environment because you're alive. That's what humans have been doing for millennia. It's like, oh, this individual that either birthed me or is raising me or whatever, it's like they survive the environment, so I'm going to fucking copy what they do because hopefully that'll lead me to surviving the environment. Like that's why we have mirror neurons in the brain. It's like that's why they're set up. Right? And like it's evolutionarily advantageous to be able to do that. However, obviously in an obesogenic environment, like if you are an individual who is overweight, obese yourself, and you are effectively teaching your kids those habits, like they're not going to be in a great position for the rest of their life. So that might mean that you have to make changes to your individual eating habits, so that your children have better eating habits as a result, which obviously, again, it's not exactly the easiest thing to do. And as we said at the start, like there are socioeconomic barriers, there's whatever other barriers. We have to park those for a second, because we've discussed them in other podcasts, etc. But we do realize that that's obviously not always the easiest thing to do, right? But if we're talking about this hypothetical, how would we set up the environment to better enable children to not be obese? That is one of the things that I would definitely prioritize. And this extends beyond just nutrition. This extends both to exercise as well, but also then in terms of like how you interact with the world. Like if you have a negative, a pessimistic view of the world, like your children are probably going to pick up on that too. And that obviously does interact with their ability to be adherent to the diet. But that's a whole host of other stuff that we're not going to get into in terms of like the psychology around food, around all this whatever. That's much more involved, much more in depth. But if you are an individual that always exercises, you're an individual that always eats healthily, the chances your children are going to do those two things go up astronomically, you know? What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. Like as I said earlier, I think that like leading from the front is really one of the most important things, and it goes beyond just like how or what you eat, for example, and not having those bad habits of eating in front of the telly and stuff like that, but also in terms of having like having a structure to how your family lives their life, as much as that is possible. Obviously, there are very significant barriers here, and they're not even just socioeconomic. It could also be like literally the opposite, that you know you're a mother or father, and you just work ridiculously hard because you're a career person and you're not home for dinner, but maybe the other parent is.
Or you
Again,
have to work 2-3 jobs because
yeah,
those
exactly.
socioeconomic status. Right?
Exactly, yeah. And the thing with that is that, you know, that becomes further challenging then if you are a single parent, for example, and maybe your children have to go to their grandmothers or whatever every now and then. Like I have, you know, two parents that raised me, but I still would, you know, my grandmother would mind me every now and then and blah blah. But that could be more of a, a a factor that comes into your family environment that could disrupt potentially the structure of, like, let's say the typical like 3 meals and a snack kind of thing, or even just the 3 meal structure. Like that seems very basic, and we've talked about this in the podcast before, where like eventually all the fit fam people and personal trainers are going to have to grow up and raise kids someday, assuming you want to have kids. And you know, what do you want them to basically inherit? Your kind of way of eating, where you just like prep a load of meals, maybe 6 meals, and eat out of Tupperware? Or the other side of things, you have no structure at all, you just track your macros and you just eat crap food all the time once it hits your macros? Like, you obviously don't want to pass those things on. So having structure within the family of, you know, there's an expectation that, yeah, we have breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning before you go to school. You're having your breakfast. It's as simple as that, you know. And then you have your lunch. Obviously, if you're in school, you have your lunch while you're at school. And then when you come home for dinner, we have our dinner at 6 p.m. That's what we do every day, or whatever. You know, obviously it's individual. Those things can be quite important. And that's not even just about those things being necessary, because obviously you all know by now it could be 2 meals, it could be 4 meals, and you could still be very healthy. But the key thing is that it sets some key habits, some key expectations and structure that carries forward then. Because it's when you move into adolescence and you become a teenager who's a bit more rebellious and stuff, that you push back against basically any structure. And the less structure there is, the less that's going to be there at the end of that. So for example, if you're like in that moody teenager phase, it might be that, you know, I just want money for lunch. All the boys go to Dunn's at lunch and they get cookies, and I just have my stupid packed lunch, you know. Those types of things start to creep up. And where that then becomes a real problem is when you go to college. And if you go to college and you've never had any structure to having breakfast, having lunch, having dinner, suddenly things just become chaotic, and you don't really know how to cook for yourself. You've never even thought about it. You never thought it was important. And now you're just having Cocoa Pops for breakfast and takeaway pizza and chips and a Coke for a fiver for your dinner. And that's where things really start to become more chaotic. But that all starts in childhood, or potentially.
Which also brings me to the next point. There's a few things you brought up there, but they come later in this discussion, Gary. You're always jumping ahead. But one of the things that you can also do with this kind of parental modeling or teaching your children, beyond just the actual act of like how to eat a better diet in terms of like getting them a protein source, like all the exact same things that apply to a normal human, like they apply to children as well. But obviously, as we said, like some things are better interventions for children as well in terms of like, getting vegetables in, hunger awareness, etc. But apart from that, teaching them to actually cook and making that a part of their lives in terms of giving them habits and giving them structure, giving them whatever, like it really does set them up so much more beneficially than if they don't know how to cook. Like you said, Gary, you go on to college, you don't know how to cook, it's like you're kind of in a bad position overall, so that's something that's definitely an early childhood skill. Like the earlier you can bring that in, the better. Now obviously, again, huge socioeconomic challenges to this, and depending on the exact household. Like, yeah, we can say like, oh, teaching kids to cook is a really beneficial habit to do, but if all you ever cook is chicken nuggets and chips, like it's not exactly teaching them a huge amount of like culinary skills to pour out a load of oven chips and a load of like, I don't know, whatever, chicken nuggets onto a fucking tray and bang them into the oven. Like it's not exactly a huge amount of cooking skills. So you might have to educate yourself more on cooking, which again, this is one of the things we've touched on and potentially we'll touch on in the future in terms of how to deal with the obesity epidemic. It's like, get some good cooking skills. That's one of the fucking major things you can do to win at this. Now, obviously, again, there's huge caveats to this because like it's just hard to first of all fit the time in, to then teach them to actually cook. But if that is something that you have the privilege of being able to do, it is obviously something that is really beneficial for the child overall, right? And this is something that potentially going forward, if you were able to, petition your school, the school that your children go to, or petition your government to have like cooking skills as a mandatory thing they do throughout the week. It doesn't have to be doing it every day. Now, obviously, there's huge barriers to that in terms of like schools now have to be outfitted with fucking cooking implements and whatever else, but it is something that would be quite beneficial. The reality of it actually being implemented is far harder, obviously, but that is something that could potentially be beneficial. The only other thing I wanted to touch on this is, this is kind of a bit controversial, but also we're talking about like more science-based things that you can do, rather than like whether this is a good thing or not. And this is, weigh your child, like monitor their weight, right? Now, obviously you don't want to be excessive about this, and you definitely don't want to teach them that they need to be hyper-focused, hyper-fixated on their weight. Like that's not a beneficial thing to do. Like I grew up boxing, and I know a lot of my peers and stuff who are very much like, they had to stay in their weight class, like, so they were very fixated on that. And I don't think that led to good habits for them later in life. But anyway, that's an aside. Obviously, we know the examples of individuals, especially young teen girls and stuff, getting like hyper fixated on their weight and, having negative outcomes as a result of that. So this one obviously has to be kind of tiptoed around, and we have to do it judiciously. But you do want to make sure that they are growing at an appropriate rate. Like we do this for newborns, for babies, in terms of monitoring their growth, and they have certain key milestones, whatever, at 3 months they should weigh this, at 6 months they should weigh this, etc. Right? Like they do that to make sure, well, in Ireland anyway, like I don't know about other countries. I think they do that in England as well. Not sure about America, not sure about Australia or any of those other places, but it's a good thing. Obviously there is issues to that. Like for example, I was born an 11-pound baby, so up until about fucking 2 years I was always above the growth trajectory, because most babies are born like fucking 7 pounds. So that's, there obviously are limitations to that, but it is a good practice to have in terms of childhood, like baby childhood, but also in terms of childhood when your children are actual children, not babies. But obviously this is something that you have to keep an eye on. Like we do it really playfully with height, like people will be like, oh, let's mark off your height there on a board in the house, or on fucking a doorway or whatever. They do it kind of playfully with that. So you could kind of do the same with weight, although maybe not, because that height stuff gets kind of competitive. Well, at least in my house is full of boys, so like that kind of got competitive. And like I'm the second tallest brother in my house. One of my brothers is 6'7", and I'm obviously like 6'5". But like that shit gets competitive. So potentially I wouldn't be, getting them to fixate on the numbers either. Like kids would be like, yeah, man, I need to eat more to fucking get up to that 100 kilos, like there's obviously the potential for that. But it is something that you should keep or potentially keep a log of, just to make sure that, they're not gaining at an excessive rate, and that they are meeting kind of normal growth trajectory. Especially this is not just applying to obesity. This is also applied to like relatively skinny kids. Like you don't want them to be undernourished. The other side of it, like in terms of they don't have enough calories, like they should still be on some sort of good growth trajectory. Like you can find figures online. Like I know there are a lot of stuff done in terms of like third world countries or developing countries, or people call them the global south, even though Australia is in the south, so that doesn't make sense. But like there are targets for different ages and different ethnicities, races, if you will, that you can follow, and they can easily be found online. And they're just kind of broad categorizations, broad generalizations. And as I said, like I was an 11-pound baby, so maybe you were too. So they're not ideal. Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
No.
Phenomenal. So you're all for it.
It's fairly straightforward.
Then I just want to touch on a few more things. Some of these, it's fairly obvious in terms of how it affects children, and some of it's not really within the parents' control. Like the stuff we just covered there, like that's somewhat in the parents' control. You have a lot of leeway around that stuff because it's your actions. And obviously, as we acknowledge, huge socioeconomic barriers, huge monetary, etc. barriers. But some of the stuff isn't necessarily within the control of like the family unit, right? And one of the things, and a major thing, is like advertising to children, right? And this is obviously, you're not going to change the media, you're not going to change the role models your children like pattern after. Like we're saying, obviously you could be a good positive role model, but if their role model is Ronald McDonald, and he's advertised on the media all the time, like you might remember earlier in your life, Gary, like there used to be proper like Happy Meal ads, like Ronald McDonald, the fucking burglar thief or whatever the fuck he was, the Hamburglar, I don't know what the fuck his name was, but like stuff like that. They used to have literal ads on that shit at children's programs, and like obviously that influences your child's psyche and their desire for food. Like I know literally I could watch an ad for McDonald's or whatever, and I will get hungry, and I'm an adult and I'm nutritionally educated, and I would like to think that I have some control over my body. However, I see that fucking burger and I'm like, would love a bite of that burger. So children are even more so influenced by this stuff. So you can either ban your children from watching TV, advertising, whatever, but realistically they're going to walk down the street and see a fucking hamburger or a Coke or whatever advertised on the side of a bus stop, on the side of a bus, on the wherever. And the only way this is actually going to change is through government intervention. And I certainly am not one for huge amounts of government intervention, as they always seem to fuck shit up, as demonstrated repeatedly by history and obviously 2020 and the COVID response. However, like they still can do good things with interventions in this area, like they did it with smoking, and that has been a raging success. So we know they can do good things, it just has to make sense, right? Do you have anything to say on the advertising to children? Because this is something that we're going to touch on more broadly in terms of advertising and economics and that kind of stuff around this, the topic of obesity. But this is something that you should be, if you have children or you want to have children in the future, or even if you don't have children and you just want a healthy functioning society in the future, like you should be campaigning for better regulation of the health food advertising space. And I know recently enough in England, like I don't keep up with everything in England, obviously, because I don't live there. They were doing some stuff for around this. They were bringing some fucking petition to government, and the government was doing what are those things called? Not a quiz,
referendum.
Not a referendum. Like they were basically reviewing the population, getting the thoughts of the population. You could fill in your fucking data, your thoughts, etc. And it was around advertising in the food space for children, I do believe. But like that's something that you could potentially intervene with in terms of the policies you vote for, the politicians you vote for, the petitions you sign, etc.
Yeah. I think you were looking for the word petition, were you?
I'm not sure if it is a petition. I think
But
there's
anyway, it doesn't matter anyway. Basically, what they were doing were proposing
they were
increases.
polling the society.
They were
That's
polling for increases in regulation of the advertisement of foods high in fat, salt, and sugar. Basically, your typical junk foods, essentially. And they've had a number of regulations like that over the years with varying success, because it does obviously have an impact, and I think that there's been various legislations related to, for example, it might just be that before the watershed time that you can't advertise certain foods, specific channels. There's some channels that are for children, not for children, etc. That also then carries over to things like YouTube. For example, there's YouTube and there's YouTube for kids. Like, do we want different advertising on YouTube for kids? All those types of things are worth considering. And I think that
just
even
on
if you're
that. Like, YouTube is actually quite good at it. Not that I'm a huge fan of YouTube, even though this goes up on YouTube. But every time we upload a video on YouTube, like, they do ask those
yeah,
questions. It's like, is this for children? Is this, does it contain this information, etc. So like, YouTube does do stuff on the back end, and obviously governments can also do stuff like that on the back end.
yeah, YouTube for kids definitely didn't exist when I was a child. When was YouTube? Well, YouTube first started like 2006, 2000, something like that. Anyway. But yeah, it was very
It
much a
certainly
free
wasn't
for.
when I was around.
Yeah, well, I actually remember Google Videos is what I used to use a lot. Google Videos.
Ogrish is what I used to use a lot as a child. I don't recommend
um, some of those other websites, stupidvideos.com, I remember that. But
it.
anyway, anyway, yeah, basically, even if you're the most like staunch like free marketeer saying that you want people to have freedom of choice, etc., like recognize that like that capacity for inhibitory control and like truly making decisions with higher order cognitive function, it basically doesn't exist when you're a child. Like it's only really developing like when it's pretty much only when you're around the age of 25. Like I'm basically just becoming an adult because my prefrontal cortex is getting to the point where it's fully developed. Like at that, up until that point, your prefrontal cortex, which is part of your brain which is responsible for that higher order, very much human function, the fact that I can have a certain feeling or impulse and I can control that a bit more, and I can coordinate different areas of my brain, like how emotional am I feeling, and that kind of rational stuff. All that is kind of at least in part controlled by the prefrontal cortex, and all of those characteristics are developing. So when you have a child, what you have to think of is that the child is fundamentally expressing like you at your worst almost. So those days where you're thinking like, oh God, all I want is food. I just want to cuddle up on the couch and I just want to feel nice, and the world is stupid and I don't want to deal with this adult stuff. Like that's a child every day. So do you want to have the freedom of corporations who are explicitly trying to sell unhealthy food to your child? Do you want them to have freedom to advertise absolutely anywhere, anytime, and thus influence your life as well? Because now you have to listen to your child saying, oh, I saw that KFC brought out the new, I don't know, triple gravy burger or whatever. Like you don't need to deal with that. So just recognize that there's you can still be very much for the free market and minimal regulation, while recognizing that, well, come on, do we need to extend that to children as well?
And also, it's like, you can say whatever you want, like, don't tread on me as a government, like, don't tread on me, like that's the typical like right-wing libertarian
Yeah,
response. But it's like, why are you saying tread on me harder, daddy, to these multinational
yeah,
corporations?
exactly.
Like what the fuck? Like I'd rather my kids weren't influenced like that. I'm like, it doesn't make sense. But anyway, look, that's for a future podcast, Gary. We will discuss that stuff
Yeah.
around the advertising. There's a few other things that I want to say, which this one is definitely controversial because it's not exactly easy. But as I said, we're putting some of those thoughts, things we discussed, to the side. And this is decreased. There is a significant decrease in levels of obesity in children with increased levels of education in the household, right? So that should just behoove you to get a better education if you want to raise children. Now, obviously, we're fucking well aware that that's not always available to individuals. And I personally am not a huge fan of universities, colleges. I think a lot of it is just a fucking a double monopoly. They have a monopoly on education and they have a monopoly on certification, which I'm all for breaking apart monopolies and starting with universities. However, I'm like, it's still a good and beneficial thing to get in terms of bettering your socioeconomic status in a lot of cases. Now, obviously, if you get a degree that is effectively worthless, like there's no jobs available, like your children might be less obese because you're better educated, but they'd probably be in a better position if you had a higher paying job, you know? And this is especially evident in certain countries where certain, and I should say states, especially in America, where certain jobs get reckless amounts of money compared to other areas, and this really dramatically increases the wealth disparity in those areas, and as a result the health disparity in those areas, you know. So basically what I'm saying is you should look after your own education. Like, I don't care if this is you getting an apprenticeship and becoming a fucking carpenter and being the best fucking carpenter that you can be. Personally, I'm all for that. You know, I grew up in an area, I'll call it a lower socioeconomic status area, and a lot of my friends went into trades, joined the army, stuff like that. So I'm all for that. However, we have to realize that even if that's the case and you have a trade, like, you can still better educate yourself, become a better tradesman. Like, that's going to lead to you getting more money in your wallet at the end of the day, which then leads to your children having a better health outcome in their lifetime, and having less risk of obesity. Would you agree with all that, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think it's fairly uncontroversial in theory, challenging in practice. You know, I mean, like, I don't think anyone would disagree that it's absolutely a good idea to become more competent at whatever it is that you wish to do, you know, whether that be, you know, going down the academic road or getting a trade or whatever it happens to be, you know, whatever serves your needs and your current skills and your path, etc. That's obviously all very much important, you know. But I think another thing to understand is that if you are someone who's kind of looking from the outside and you're just saying, yeah, you know, if all these people just got educated, we wouldn't have an obesity problem. Like, it's not necessarily that simple either. It's not like someone could just go home and say, oh, you know, all right, I'm going to go on Google tonight, let me teach myself something. You know, okay, education is a mediator, because, or at least partially because, it is a component of or related to socioeconomic status. So it's tied to other variables, but it's also tied to the career trajectory of that person and potentially nutrition and health literacy as well. Obviously, totally depends on the field. So yeah, there's multiple different things that are kind of baked into the cake there when we say education. So don't just, you know, turn to someone, you know, who has children who are obese and say, well, you've got Google, come on, let's get reading. Like,
Like, oh, you need to get a master's level education before your children are not going to be obese, Gary. Don't you know? Um,
yes.
but yeah, so like, that's obviously controversial enough. And as Gary said, like, extremely multifactorial. And it is something we will discuss in future episodes further. As I said before, we're not going to touch on everything in this episode. But the other thing I wanted to touch on, again, related to something that is quasi in your control in terms of how you interact with the world, but completely outside your control at the same time. And this is, you can petition your school to follow healthy eating guidelines and also then follow exercise guidelines. And the exercise guidelines for children are to get 60 minutes of exercise per day. You know, it doesn't need to be all at once, but, you know, spread up throughout the day. Like, and that can include like walking to school and, you know, jogging to school, like cycling to school, whatever, you know. Now, obviously, again, that's not always available to children. So this is why you petition your school to get them to do exercise of some form each day. Like, I know schools that literally don't let their kids run during break. You know, it's like, it's fairly reckless. Or they don't have an outside space. And again, that's fairly reckless. And now, again, I know there's obviously situations where you just simply can't have that, but you have to deal with the fact that children need to exercise. And this is especially important for boys, and something near and dear to my heart as someone who has ADHD. Like, if you don't let these boys, especially because they're more likely to present with this and burn off this excess energy, like, they're going to have worse outcomes in school as a result of not being able to focus, right? And if you know your child is like that, then again, I would just definitely petition the school to get some exercise in throughout the day. Let them burn off that fucking energy, whether it's playing football, fucking organized fights, I don't know. But you get some sort of exercise in throughout the day. And if you can't get that, then definitely consider, if possible, with your work commitments, etc., getting some exercise in before school or at least after school. So outside activities, join a soccer club, join a GA club, join a boxing club, whatever it is, get them to do some sort of activity. If you like to exercise, find a club. Now it's not always possible, and especially as we've talked in other episodes, like you might not have access to these facilities in your area. But again, growing up in a lower socioeconomic area, like I know that we would just organize stuff. Like there's definitely like town halls around that you can do. Like I know one of the lads, his dad used to box, and he just charged us all a $5 per class or something like that, and then taught us all to box. And like that was what we did as children, right? And obviously through my teen years, etc. But like there's stuff like that, you can definitely organize it. Like if your school has a hall, like I remember doing like karate and stuff as a child in my national school, the hall in there, a few nights per week. So there's stuff that you can do to get your child exercising throughout the day. Either you as an individual bringing them to school and petitioning your school to do exercise throughout the day, but then also bringing them to extracurricular activities if possible. Again, I know that's not always possible, but it is something to consider. And if not, at least let them play outside on the local green if there is one, kicking a football around or something. If you have a backyard, again, ideal. I know a lot of people live in apartments and stuff, but there's usually some sort of green space or something somewhere in the area. And if you have the ability to bring them there, that would be ideal. But as I said, some of this is outside your control, and you're just going to have to petition your school or petition local government to get access to green spaces or get access to, gym equipment, fucking monkey bars and shit for the kids in your local area. Like it's a harder thing to engage with, but it is something that you should be thinking about if you are raising kids.
Yes, sir. What's your next thing so I know what I have permission to say?
You can go on to whatever you want. The other things are, as I said to you before this podcast, the more kind of teenager related things.
Yeah. I think like one of the important things that definitely is relevant to adolescence, but is also relevant to childhood, is something that I know we are going to move on to, and that is, what do you like? What's the culture of celebration? You kind of already mentioned this, but like for example, if you're treating yourself and there's a night that you do something, or there's a Saturday or Sunday activity, for example, is it a case that it's just, oh yeah, we just get food and we just, eat loads of food and that's all we do? Or is it a case that it's actually some sort of health promoting behavior? Like for example, on a Saturday, our family, we normally go for a walk, or we go for a hike, or we do something along those lines. Or maybe it's the case that we all go swimming and then we get some nice food. It's not necessarily to say that you have to always couple those two things, but all of those things go on to add up over time. Like for example, if there's even 2 nights a week where it's like a family activity night, and that family activity is just getting takeaway, like that all adds up. That's twice a week, that's 8 times a month. Like that really does add up over the long term. And it's not necessarily just that you're going to end up in a surplus of calories on those nights, like you likely will, but it also just begins to build that habit of just constantly associating those nice occasions with food, as opposed to it being a case that you get into the habit of actually doing nice things that are not related to food. Because that's the reality of like our modern life. Like it is very easy to just kind of Deliveroo, get a takeaway, or get a load of food in and just eat it in the house and watch some movies or whatever, because everything's really accessible. Obviously it's not made any easier by lockdown, so I don't blame you if you've been doing that. But those things are all really important to consider, and it also goes beyond just family in that sense, in that it's also the kind of socialization element, like or socializing, even how you socialize as an individuals. Like, so for example, as a child moves into adolescence, like what do they do when they meet their friends? Is it just all about meeting for food because they don't have anything else to do. And same as a family, you know, when you meet with other families, is it again, it's all just about food. Or anytime you bring their friends over, it's just a case that you just give them loads of junk, and it's as simple as that. Obviously, those things are nice every now and then, but you don't want to make every kind of positive event be tied to getting some sort of takeaway or getting loads of junk food, because it obviously loses its value in some ways, and it also has that conditioning effect, as we said. But there's also another part to that kind of conditioning element, and that's that the more takeaway and the more junk you eat, and I say junk just because it's quick. Like, obviously, you guys listening to the podcast know, like, yeah, you can eat, you know, these foods in moderation, etc. But if you're eating these foods all the time, it makes it less likely that the individual is going to enjoy meals that are more healthful. Like, for example, if you serve up chicken nuggets 4 times a week, and then the other 3 nights we're having, like, I don't know, chicken breast and a couple of falafels and some broccoli, like, that's unlikely to be very palatable. So you also have to realize that conditioning is, and the development of those habits also has, you know, some basis in basic biology or neurobiology on the level of, you know, your actual taste buds, in terms of what you find palatable, and taste buds, and obviously the brain related to that. And yeah, that's something that comes into this as well. So there you've got a lot of different layers built into this when it comes to the socializing, and also the celebration, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like and this, as you said, like it does apply for both the childhood stuff, but almost even more so as they get more freedom themselves in terms of
Yeah.
like their teen years. Because whatever about like you're in control, like you're just like, okay, cool, we're going home now. They all of a sudden get a cutoff with the food they have access to, you know, at this celebratory event, whatever it is. But if they are free living and they're able to do whatever the fuck they want, as teenagers are, you know, off to do, and they get into college or university or out into the working world, whatever, like, especially as they have more money available to them and they have more freedom, if they don't have clear structures in place in terms of how to structure, first of all, their day, they don't have cooking skills, as Gary touched on earlier on, like, you're effectively just throwing them to the wolves, right? You're not setting them up for success. Like, basically, you have 18 years of free play on this earth, right? And that's obviously not the case for everyone. Like, people die before 18 and whatever else. But you basically are given 18 years of free play. You're told you have 18 years to master. That's on the fucking level 1. You know, this is the intro level of the game of life, right? And then you're free to go by yourself. So you, as an adult, if you've ever played video games, you're effectively that like tutorial. You're teaching that kid how to navigate the world, and you don't want to leave them in a situation where they don't know how to navigate the world after that 18 years old, and then they're left into a society, a system that is obesogenic, because we know it is, and they don't have skills to navigate that situation. They don't have skills to navigate the world, because you didn't help them with cooking skills. You didn't help them with clear structure around the diet. You didn't help them with, you know, getting vegetables into their diet, like all the stuff we've been touching on. Like, that's not a good place to leave your kid. And this is especially true as we start navigating the teen years, because there's things that you can do in the teen years that are the same things we've talked about before on the podcast, and we've, you know, written about and we've done whatever about, in terms of like how to deal with like meals out. Like, how are you going to deal with that? The same way you deal with it for a child is the same way you deal with it for an adult. You know, it's like you have to have some sort of plan of action for that, whether it's creating some sort of calorie buffer, making more mindful choices, better like healthful choices when you're out, whatever. We've talked about it before. I'm not going to get into it, but this is especially true when we deal with alcohol, especially in Irish society. Like, alcohol is, you know, ever present. Like, you have to teach your kids responsible alcohol use, which generally implies you have to have responsible alcohol use, because, as we said, children will pattern. You know, they'll do what you do. So if you are in the pub 7 nights per week, like, they're probably going to do something similar, right? Or if they're not allowed in the pub, like, they'll be out in the field somewhere, right? Like, that's just what Irish people do, right? So again, like, you have to think about that stuff as you are raising kids. Now, again, some of the stuff you're not going to be able to do, depending on your situation, but there is more responsible ways to deal with the situation. And obviously there's more responsible ways to help your children deal with the situation as they are teenagers, as they go to the world. And yeah, obviously on top of that as well is like teaching them to be more present with the meals they do choose, like that. They're all obviously good behaviors to have, but effectively you just want to teach them to navigate social situations and to navigate a life. Like that's what you're setting them up for. And the same things you're going to deal with in your day-to-day life, like maybe you're trying to change your body composition, maybe you're trying to live a healthier life, like they're the same things that they're going to encounter. So why not get them, or give them a head start on that stuff, right? Let them bypass all the fucking mistakes that you made and get them into a better position. So teach them the little hacks that you found out. Teach them the fucking way you navigate things. Now, you might not do it perfectly, but also realize that even if you're not doing things perfectly, just by the act of actually trying to get on top of this stuff, you're doing better than 90% of people who don't try, So like that's just stuff to be aware of. Just on top of that, then I just had a few other things. You don't have to eat out of Tupperware to get results. So that's, as we said at the start, like you need to teach your kids beyond just like this kind of fit fam, like excessive or obsessive, I should say, macro tracking, and obsessive like meal planning in terms of like all your meals are Tupperware. You do meal prep for the whole week. Like that's perfectly fine. Again, if you're trying to be absolutely shredded, great. But you should be able to eat with your kids sometimes, because again, they're going to pattern you. And if you always eat out of a lunchbox, they're going to want to always eat out of a lunchbox, and that's potentially beneficial, but potentially not beneficial as well. You just have to be aware of the trade-offs, right? And you also have to teach them how to fit in, we'll call it like fun food, like junk food, as Gary was saying, into your diet, like how to strategically use that, as we touched on earlier on. Like you don't want to necessarily use it as a reward all the time, but it still can become something that you introduce your kids to, because you also don't want to be that parent that's like, oh no, my kid only eats, gluten-free, fucking hypoallergenic foods, macrobiotic, vegan, whatever the fuck, right? It's like you don't want to be that individual as well, because right well, they're just going to go over to their babushka's house and she's going to feed them whatever the fuck she wants, right? Or they're going to go to their friend's family for a sleepover, or a birthday party, or fucking whatever, and then they're going to be eating all those numbers in those fucking Smarties, Skittles, fucking cake, whatever the fuck, right? So this is something that you're going to have to navigate. There's no really perfect way to navigate that. You're going to have to use your best judgment, but you want to make your children normal as well as being healthy, right? And that's a really tough line to navigate. And unfortunately, I don't have the secret for you. Anyway, Gary, I think that kind of wraps up. Like, obviously, this is a huge thing that we could speak for days, write a book on, fucking do a world tour on. We're not going to, likely. But do you have anything else to add to this whole discussion of dealing with childhood obesity? Because as we said at the start, like, we don't want to necessarily give you the exact pathway to navigate all this stuff. I just wanted to make you aware of, we'll call them good habits, because that kind of highlights bad habits, and hopefully helps you, navigate the whole situation with that. And as I said, like, I hate when these things, they effectively always come off as like finger wagging or finger pointing or whatever. And that's not my intention at all. Mm-hmm. Like, as I said, realistically, I don't care how you live your life or how you live your kids' lives. I would ideally like a good, healthy society, but I'm very much a right-wing libertarian in my beliefs and how I don't want to be, I just want to be left alone. Effectively, like, if it was up to me, I would live in a fucking cabin in the woods with lots of guns. But that's not the society we live in. So I'm just saying that I don't care how you raise your kids. Anyway, Gary, do you have anything else to say?
Just I guess one final thing is something that will hopefully not sound like finger wagging, and that is that like something that can be prevalent for some kids at different ages, and I think is a particular problem now that people can retreat into online worlds, is the topic of weight stigma. So if people do feel like they're being bullied, for example, for their weight at school, maybe it's explicit in that people are, you know, calling them names or whatever, or maybe it's just implicit in that maybe people won't hang around with them, or they don't ask them to play soccer because they're like, oh, well, that kid's fat, you know, they don't play sports or whatever. That can actually be quite harmful. And the reason I bring that up is because some people might have a kind of a simplistic idea that we should just be more vocal about telling people that they, you know, shouldn't be fat because of this, that, and the other. And like, there's a difference between putting out the information and making it sort of like the smoking situation, because that's kind of what we did a little bit about with smoking. If you look at some of the more like vulgar ads, for example, like they would very much stigmatize the smoker. But I guess one of the things there that is a little bit different is that it's an isolated behavior. There's a single thing that you change to get rid of it, and it's all adults primarily, you know. Whereas in this case, it is a bit more sensitive, and there's many other reasons why it's more sensitive. But particularly when we focus on kids and weight stigma, what can happen is that if a child, you know, is in that situation where they're being bullied, as I said, explicitly or implicitly in some way, what can end up happening is that they basically retreat to more obesogenic behaviors. An example of that would be like if you live in a housing estate, let's say you play soccer up the back, and then, you know, people don't want you to play soccer anymore because, you know, they're calling you fat or whatever, and they're saying, oh no, you can't run, you're not fast or whatever. The thing that happens then is the person becomes less physically active. There's generally higher rates of binge eating after that. And there's also the case that the person can just retreat to video games. Like, that's such an easy thing to do these days, and it's a very easy way to kind of develop a false sense of socializing and like false relationships, because you just talk to people on the headset, you know, and that kind of feels like your new world. And then obviously once you become of age to play or to be on social media and go on the different chat rooms and groups and whatever, you again can find another community. So again, there's a very easy way of kind of moving through life, backing away from things that are pushing against you. So that's not necessarily to say that, you know, if you're obviously you're not a child listening to this, but it's not
Never know,
necessarily
man.
it's not necessarily the child that has control over this, but it is something, I guess, maybe if you're a parent and you have kids, to be aware of, that if your child is, you know, bullying someone else because of their weight or whatever, that it is something that actually matters. And while we can be all hard and say, oh no, it's fine, that will help them, you know, diet and improve their weight, like that's just not what happens in the real world. And what we tend to see is actually the opposite effect. So you do have to bear that in mind.
100%, Gary. And that is something that we will also talk about in future
Yeah,
episodes.
that's a big topic as well.
But yeah, I have nothing else to say. This is a fairly meaty one. Like, even though the stuff is, I think, fairly intuitive in terms of people know what to do, but that's just because it's intuitive doesn't mean that it gets done. And this is obviously part of a larger series. And I know people will listen to this in isolation and be like, what the fuck is this information? You know, this is obviously intuitive. It's not great, or fucking whatever. But it needs to be covered in the overall discussion, as we said at the start, this kind of timeline of causality with obesity, because for a lot of people, it does start with the habits and whatever stuff around nutrition and training and exercise that they pick up in childhood, right? So if we can solve the childhood issue, then we might not solve the obesity issue now, but hopefully we start moving it in a better direction in the future, you know? And again, this is the same thing with smoking, even though, yes, I'm sure a lot of individuals stopped smoking as a result of, you know, the interventions from government, etc. And I know that's the case, but realistically, the payoff comes by less people starting, you know, like the risk of you getting cancer after stopping smoking for 20 years, smoking 20 packs a fucking day or whatever. It's like your risk is still elevated, you know? However, the risk for an individual that never started smoking because of all the interventions, like, they're in a far better place, you know? So like, that's why I'm saying it's better to target the children to get the results that we want in future, right? But yeah, I have nothing else to really say. Gary, where can people find us, find more information about us, etc.?
As always, one of the best things you can do is subscribe to our newsletter, the Triage Method newsletter, linked below. You can subscribe, keep up with everything that we're doing. You can also join the Triage Method community, which is our Facebook group. But obviously, if you want to get the next level, you want to, level up as a coach and gain more knowledge, we do have the Coaches Corner, which is our membership platform. Okay. So some of you may have noticed, if you've been on our website recently, that, you won't find a lot of the articles that you would have found previously, because basically what we're doing is we're using all of that content to formulate more in-depth, more comprehensive, more complete content for the Coaches Corner. So we offer both video lectures, isolated videos as well, I should say, as well as written content now within the Coaches Corner. So there's a lot of meat to sink your teeth into if you are interested as a coach or as an interested trainee. Also, we do have coaching. So if you are looking to just work on your own goals, you'd like our help with those, then we do coach individuals, and we would be happy to take you on, particularly as we head into the new year, and hopefully the gyms will be staying open. We do obviously have clients from across the waters as well, not just in Ireland, and lockdowns seem to be varying all over the place. I have a client in Florida, she's also in lockdown. Our UK clients are now in lockdown, or at least some of them, and our Irish clients are the free ones for the moment, but
For the moment.
there we go. So yeah, otherwise, guys, just follow us along on social media. You can follow at Triage Method on Instagram and everywhere else. You can also follow at The Real Paddy Farrell. That's Paddy's account on Instagram. He's looking to increase his followers, and he's putting out a lot of content there with independent posts. So would recommend, and also, of course, follow myself at Skinny Gaz on Instagram, and you'll just see me reposting random stuff on my story. So yeah, that's everything, guys.
Going to get you to change your name to the Lord Skinny Gaz or Lord Skinny Gaz. I think that's a more fitting title.
Yeah, Lord Skinny Gaz. That's my username for some things, so maybe I'll need to do it someday. That's the name of my laptop, actually, I think.
Anyway, I have nothing else to say. As Gary said, Coach's Corner, get in there. Like, the content in there is really coming next level, and it's really fleshing out into a place to be if you are interested in becoming the best coach you can possibly be. But also, as Gary said, if you're just interested in training and you're like, I want to know how to diet more effectively, like, it just makes sense that if this is the stuff we're teaching coaches, the secret hacks and tricks and whatever else, like, and you want to do that to yourself, like becoming more competent in your ability to do that stuff, it just makes sense. It's just common sense. So yeah, get involved if you will. It's linked below, and you can always reach us on social media to discuss it. I'm sure Gary doesn't mind, talking to you on his Instagram DMs.
I do.
But also with Triage DMs, like, you can talk about that stuff, or you can email us and we can talk you through whatever it is that you need help with. And we do also offer consultations. I've been doing quite a few with individuals. It's quite fun. But obviously that's more of a niche thing. But yeah, I have nothing else to say. I hope everyone has a wonderful new year, and I hope everyone had a phenomenal Christmas. Do you have anything else to say, Gary, finally?
No, I think that's it. Enjoy your, or you already had Christmas, so enjoy your New Year's. Hopefully, if we're not locked down, you can go out and get yourself a New Year's meal, a substantial meal and a drink. But yeah, it does. I'm not hopeful about us being open on New Year's, to be honest. I think my prediction for now, as of the 20th of December, is that lockdown will be reintroduced before the New Year. So there you go. Sorry to ruin your week, folks.
I unfortunately agree with you, but who the fuck knows? Like, it's not like they use logic or reason to do the lockdowns in the first place. So you cannot use logic or reason to say whether they will or will not do the lockdowns. So who the fuck knows? But yeah, I'm hoping that 2021, it just turns midnight, January 1st, just the 1 minute past on January 1st, and COVID just ceases to exist. That would be ideal, in my mind at least. But yeah, I have nothing else to say. Follow us on the social medias, and enjoy your new year.